Welcome to the Practical Creative Podcast, where I interview artists and creatives about the how and why of what they do. I'm Jeremiah Craigie, an actor and an artist. And in this mini-series of the podcast, I'm focusing on the topic of creative risk, diving into practices that embody a high degree of risk-taking and uncertainty, but in very different ways. In this episode, I'm speaking with Cassils, a visual artist working in live performance, film, sound, sculpture, and photography. They have achieved international recognition for rigorous engagement with the body as a form of social sculpture. So what does this look like in practice? It means creating powerful works of art across a host of media, often with a strong performative element. This includes undergoing a gruelling physical transformation to gain 23 pounds of muscle in 23 weeks, saving all of their urine for 200 days, or being set on fire by a stunt team. And we dig into the meaning behind each of these in the interview. All of Cassils' artworks are rooted in deep, conceptual, and often political explorations. And although they often involve a degree of risk, they are never reckless, a distinction Cassils is very clear to make. Some of the topics we covered in this conversation include the rigorous approach applied to creating new pieces of work, responding to prompts, how they've created work in response to both commissions and emerging cultural and political events, how they think about risk and why it's become a feature in their work, why performing live in front of an audience has been integral to many of their pieces. And we finish with a brilliant creative challenge that really asks us to consider the power of our skills as artists and how we choose to use it. I started the conversation by jumping straight in and asking Cassils for some context on how they navigate the process of taking an idea into a completed work. Please enjoy. What is the process for creating new work? How do you navigate that initial inspiration through to finding how it's going to be communicated to the world?
I'd say my process is very much formed by the context of which I'm living in that moment. I'm often responding to a sort of container which is often formed via a sort of socio-political lived experience and responding creatively to that, I feel, is one of the last places that artists can carve out a sort of slice of agency in a world that is stripping so much of our agency. There's a artist I've recently been working with called Jackie Simo, and she says so intelligently that one of the first victims of capitalism is the imagination, and I very much agree with that.
So, at a very practical level, then, how do you determine what is the right expression for the ideas that you're trying to communicate? Because you work with, clearly there's the performative element, but there's also, there are materials involved, be it fire or ice or clay or photography. How do you determine what is the best medium for conveying that message?
Well, it really depends on what the message is, right? So many different mediums possess formal properties. Some works are best made through a sound installation. Some are best made through, I'd say that pretty much all of my work starts with the germ of a live performance. And then from that, I extend the works into different mediums because obviously, the typical documentation of a performance, pointing a camera at it, unedited, on a tripod, very rarely does that actually capture the sort of essence and spirit of what it is that's happening in a sort of energetic transmutation when you're there live, right? And so often when I'm thinking about how do I carry on the sort of red thread of that idea beyond that ephemeral moment, that's when I turn to different mediums. And depending on the sort of strength of that medium and the specificity of the idea, I'll match, well, this really makes sense to remove people's ability to see in this moment, because actually this is about denying the ability to gaze, and it's about having a connection to another human beyond what they look like. Therefore, I'll use sound. Or this is about, I'd say a lot of a lot of the material choices I make are about troubling the idea of looking, thinking about the lens of ice or the difficulty to see through fire, which constantly moves and transforms. The kind of you thinking about the formal properties of constant change and how to represent that. You know, denying people static gaze is a big part of what I do. And so I'm always thinking of different sort of formal choices to kind of play that forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because I was so impressed when reading about your body of work, watching or tracing the progression of an idea. For example, your piece Becoming an Image, which is very performative, where you're entering a space and you're working with a piece of clay and shaping it physically. That's a performance with an audience, but the audience is only seeing what you're doing in the flashes of the photography, which in itself is an extra layer. It's a very theatrical extra layer of performance, but those flashes are actually recording moments that then become a photographic exhibition. And the clay at one point is then recast and becomes another piece, becomes a sculpture. And then that sculpture is then the core of a processional piece, your movement push. And do you have this mapped out in your mind from the beginning, or do these evolve over time?
They evolve over time. So, for example, Becoming an Image was, again, like I often respond to prompts, right, or to conditions. So, Becoming an Image was initially a work that was requested by the One Archive, which is the largest LGBT archive in North America. Mm-hmm. And there was an exhibition called Trans Activations, which was about the trans content present in this archive. And like many archives, this archive was present with the work of, in this case, dead gay white guys. But other than that, there was not a lot of representation. And so rather than trying to find, and this was a long time ago, I mean, this was like 2010 or 11, I think. So rather than trying to find the one or two representations of trans folks in that archive, I decided to create a work that pointed to all the missing lived experience that happens in a canon when a canon is formed. And so the idea was to gut the room of an archive, to turn it into a blackout chamber, and to use clay as a sort of stand-in for a body, right? Because if you think about, creation myths across time, clay is a stand-in for body. And so there's a 2,000-pound monolith of clay that's placed in the center of the gutted archive. That's turned into a blackout space so dark that you can't see your hand in front of your own face. The audience is loaded in the dark, not knowing what's in there, not knowing what to expect, only smelling the scent of clay. And yes, you're right, the work takes place in total blindness and complete darkness, pitch blackness. But I'm not carving a sculpture I can't see. I too can't see, just as you can't see, just as the photographer can't see. Everybody is collectively blind. And it is only through the accidental illumination of a flash that people glimpse as to what is happening. And so the point of the work is really not to make a sculpture or to make a photograph. The point of the work is to express in that moment how mediation really forms and forges our understanding of collective truth and all of the violence that takes place in the dark that we're not privy to unless we kind of hang on to a sort of digital file. So the initial idea was something like that this work was something that you would barely witness, that you would, and yet you knew it was happening. And yet, perhaps based on the physiology of your body, the way your eyeball works, the sort of life experience you bring to this work, the way that the retinal burn hovers in your eye, you see it in black and white, green and purple, everybody's body works differently. And what this does is it illuminates the construct of something that we view as factual, the photograph. And that was the point. And then after the piece, I was left with the sculpture, and that was something I hadn't anticipated until the first, and then after seeing the sculpture, I was like, oh, wow, this is really, if we're thinking about the formal shape, what is a formal shape of violence? This is in fact a totally faithful index of an attack.
Mm.
And yes, it's made by my body, but it could be any body, the cumulative marks of violence over time, over history. And so that's when we decided to turn it into a sculpture.
And the marks that you were making, the physicality or the movement that you were using to shape that piece. And I know, as you say, you weren't trying intentionally to sculpt it.
Mm.
What was the vocabulary, or what was the intention in those movements as they were in terms of how they interacted with the clay?
So the sort of impetus was to like beat the shit out of it, you know, to basically take it down, but take it down blind. So to prepare for this, I mean, I have a sort of second life as I've run a personal training business for 20 years, and I'm an ex semi-pro boxer and an ex athlete, and I see the body as both an instrument and an image. And so, you know, to create this work, I trained using Muay Thai techniques, boxing techniques, and then also cardiovascular training to keep the heart rate up at 165, 170 beats per minute for as long as I could without losing form, because the minute you start to slip or your form starts to slip, you're likely to have injury. So it was really about maintaining the intensity and the proficiency of the attack to the point where it wouldn't do harm to me. But of course, I'm blind as well, so there's that aspect. But I would train blindfolded sometimes for this work, or hit target practices with my eyes closed. So ways of sort of anticipating and developing a sense of where things are without using your eyes, which is like a sort of larger metaphor for the piece, is for people to kind of think about perceiving the present without reliance on the things that they lean on in order to reveal truth.
And you said you were surprised by what resulted, by this physical object that was left behind at the end of the performance. How did you then go about finding a purpose for that, or essentially taking that and using that as the beginning of yet another piece, or an extension of? In fact, actually, that's another question as part of it. Do you see what came out of it as a separate piece, or as a continuation of an exploration?
It's both. It's both a continuation and a separate piece, right? Everything is connected. There is no beginning and ending, and so a body of work is simply a culmination of one work after the other that's informed by the other one that comes before it. And sometimes they're different, but they are, of course, linked, right? The reason, I guess, the sort of conceptual idea that I was interested in conveying was very much the retinal burn, and thinking about photography in relationship to an archive. That was something that I was actively thinking about when I first made Becoming an Image. The sculpture was something that revealed itself through the process. And then upon seeing that, I realized, that it was actually a really interesting object. And that's so often when we're talking about history, and we're talking about, for example, the histories of monuments, for example, how problematic they are because they lean on the politics of representation. So 3 women gazing to the stars, which women, what are their subjectivities? Who are their histories? What do they look like? But there is a sort of there's a sort of possibility that opens up an abstraction. And so this sculpture, that's really quite an abstract piece that's forged through a faithful index of a human body attacking, yet it does not point exclusively to my body. And so when you're thinking about a monument that speaks to the history of violence, I felt like, well, conceptually this worked quite well, because it didn't necessarily get hung upon the meat of my body. It could be a body, any body, in many ways. And so the idea became then to think about creating another sort of, again, I guess the repetition in the idea is the notion of the index is something I'm really interested in. The trace, the index, as a stand-in for, just the photo of a body where people can get fascinated on the genitals of a trans person, versus all the urine that leaks from my body could also have leaked from yours, or a bashed, like the indent of a fist from being bashed, is different than seeing the crumpled face of the victim, So how do we get through these ideas of universality and corporeal shared experience versus the sort of salacious, voyeuristic tendencies that we have when thinking about a subjectivity that is other? And so the indexical, the idea of the trace, is something that I've formally been developing across my practice as a way of answering that problem. And so the sculpture then became this idea, well, what about if you were to place this monument in sites where violence against gender nonconforming and trans people had taken place? You could put this sculpture as a way to illuminate, again, the concept of an erased history, but only having, money to make like one or two sculptures begged the question, well, whose histories do you illuminate and whose do you leave out? And that became the sort of logic for mounting it on a 1,000-pound steel plinth on wheels and then needing, like 20 to 40 people to roll it around to different sites, and that became a new work. I would say that's, it's using the shape and it's taking part of, it's kind of recycling aspects of becoming an image, but it's kind of giving it a different sort of context and a different moment, a different meaning, different material.
Yeah, I think there's something so wonderfully evocative and universal about so much of your work that I see, in that you are really looking at the body, but in many different ways, obviously. And I guess what I'm getting at is that you're looking at a shared experience, that we all have bodies and we all have an understanding of the physical experience. Although they are very different, it is also a common. It's a space where we can all meet, and this really struck me with your piece "Piss," where you're collecting urine, and it becomes. There's something delightful about the fact that it's something that we all can relate to. But you're using it in a very particular context. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that piece, where it came from, and how you came to choosing that specific medium. Again, I'm fascinated by medium because it speaks so it's so laden with scope for interpretation, and meaning.
Sure. So Pissed is a work that came about in relation to the 2016 government ordinance, where the current administration rescinded an ordinance that Obama had passed, which allowed transgender teens to urinate in their bathroom of choice versus the gender they were assigned at birth. This was legislation that was years in the making, hard fought. Many activists, many young people, many ACLU lawyers had fought very hard for trans folks, especially young trans folks, to get these rights. And one of the first things that this administration did was to overturn that. And, as we were discussing earlier, that's not a surprise, but the sort of cruelty that is imparted against not only just trans people, but trans children, what it is to be a child and how difficult it is to be a teenager, and to have your identity forming. All of us can relate to how horrible it is to be a teenager, but then to have this extra layer of prejudice placed upon you at that like really important developmental moment, to me, just was intolerable. And it made me very angry, And so I thought, this is ridiculous. Everybody should send their urine to the White House, just like FedEx because it really dictates who's able to perform a common bodily function with peace of mind and who is not, you know. And so I was kind of joking that we should all FedEx our piss to the White House. And my lawyer, as I was going through my citizenship application, said, "Don't do that. It's actually considered a biohazard and it would be considered a felony." And I was like, wow, that's pretty wild that body fluid can be deemed a felony in this moment. You can literally make a bomb with your own urine. But really, I started that day. It was not a sort of thought through piece as something like Becoming an Image was, which kind of bubbled over time and became a concept. It was literally a knee-jerk response to start saving my urine from that day forward. So from that date that this decree was ordered, I started to save every drop of urine that my body passed, up until an exhibition that I had slated 200 days later to showcase just how much a human body would have to mitigate this issue based on an oppressive government ordinance, and how, yes, we all have this, bodily function, but not everybody has to deal with the politics of it in the same way based on their subjectivity and their privilege, right? And so it was a way of hyper-performing this sort of abstract law that was passed by showcasing the sheer amount of fluid that a single human being had to contend with. Mm-hmm. And that resulted in a large sculpture, about 3.5 by 3.5 foot plexi cube, that's mounted on a white plinth. The plinth is actually, the sculpture very much looks like a minimalist sort of Hans Hoppe condensation cube type reference, or Soluit, or many of the sort of minimalist rhetoric formally that preceded it. And yet it's injected with this very different form and this kind of political content. But the plinth itself is a hacked refrigerator that would circulate the urine in the cube, keeping it cold, because it is in fact a bodily fluid. It must be refrigerated, otherwise it rots. So there was all these kind of real time problems that needed to be solved. The larger political issue, the way of representing that, and then, God, how am I gonna store like 200 gallons of urine, and how am I gonna get that to New York City when it's a felony to send it, and like all of that stuff. How do I preserve it? I had to consult with a biochemist and create a formula, because nobody preserves urine. They take maybe a UTI test and then chuck it, but nobody's thinking about, how do I hold on to this for months?
It's extraordinary to me the lengths that you go to create your work. Just the logistics of that piece sound complicated at the least, but also politically charged. And so much of your work requires either exceptional physical endurance or mental endurance, as well as the tenacity to solve the problems that arise along the way. I read about your preparing for cuts, I believe, perhaps you could, for people who aren't familiar with the piece, what cuts was. And then the question I had regarding it was, what keeps you going when it's so physically grueling, when you have to force feed yourself in order to maintain the calorie intake that you need over such a long period of time? What keeps you focused on that end result and keeps you motivated throughout that process?
Well, cuts for traditional sculpture was an artwork that was responding to art historical work by Eleanor Anton called Carving, a traditional sculpture, as well as another work by Linda Benglis named Advertisement. I was invited by Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions in 2011 as part of an exhibition that was pointing to the performative histories of Southern California to respond to the archive of Lace's archive. And so I picked these two sort of really important feminist works that had quite different takes on a similar concept. And the concept was society's control of a woman's body in terms of the sort of conditions and affects expected of a woman's body, either in terms of the politics of representation or in terms of having a career, for example, in the case of Benglis. And so Eleanor Antin had done a piece in 1972 where she had starved herself for several days, taking a photographic sort of self-portrait from all four angles, a sort of scientific analytic reference of the body in black and white, again, very indexical, front, back, side, and side. And she took those photographs every day as her body wasted. And that was kind of speaking to this history of sculpture and the sort of expectations of a woman's body in relation to material, but specifically also thinking about how the classical sculpture will look at the block of marble and find the beauty and kind of draw it out from within. So sort of taking those those ideas, the expectations around thinness and beauty, and kind of tongue-in-cheek playing with the notion of discovery within a formal block of marble, and kind of wedding those two. And Benglis, her work was a 2-paged fold-out in Artform magazine back, I think, in 1973, which featured a photograph of her naked with a double-ended dildo inserted inside her. And she's got these kind of cat-eye sunglasses that are pulled down the bridge of her nose, and she's winking. And it's essentially a pinup. And she had been partnered with many male artists, and she herself had a really prolific career, and she would see her, boyfriends and fellow male artists just, their careers taking off. And she had this, this glass ceiling experience that many women artists were having. And so she had tried to get reviews of her work in journals such as Artforum, which of course would never pay attention. And so she instead bought 2 pages of advertisement and then put this pinup of herself, put this pinup of herself in the back as a sort of way to speak to how women were represented and what a woman had to do in order to kind of get ahead in their career. So anyways, those were the 2 works that I was intersecting with. And I was thinking about the politics of trans representation, which in 2011 was really different than it is today. We didn't have words like non-binary or even the idea of trans was really like, well, if you are trans, you are trapped in the wrong body, and you must be a man, or you must be a woman in a man's body and a man in a woman's body. Like, it was a very sort of didactic dialogue, and there was very little representation. And so I was interested in taking Antin's notion of the body as a sculptural object, and rather than starving myself as Antin had, through the feminine act of wasting, I would use my knowledge of kinesiology, of bodybuilding, of nutrition to extend that line of the sand around the notions of gender. And so, again, just like playing with this idea of the body as a sculptural object, and the material conditions of flesh being something that one had some form of agency over, resisting the sort of then idea that in order to officially transition, you had to take hormones or have interventive surgeries. I was kind of making the argument that actually, my body is not the problem. It's society's expectations of bodies, especially in relationship to gender, that are the problem. And so the project started there.
I'm sorry, I missed that last part. Our relationship to the expectations of our bodies and gender.
Yeah, just saying that that initially, I think people think that the body is the problem, but I actually believe that it's society's conception of the body that is the real problem.
I also think it's interesting the way you were describing the wasting away versus the approach that you took, which was of essentially bulking up.
Yeah.
It just underscores the difference of our expectations of what different genders should do in order to achieve a certain ideal.
that
Right.
women should lose weight, men should literally gain weight by gaining muscle mass. To go to my earlier question, then what keeps you going when you're, for most artists working in other medium, the medium is external, so they can take a break, they can step away from the canvas or from the clay or from whatever it is, and then come back to it. They can have a nap and eat whatever they want, and then they can go back to it. Whereas when you're doing something like this, you don't have that option. Everything, your life becomes strictly controlled for the duration of the process. I'd like to hear you speak to both some of that process, what the actual elements of that transformation were, how you managed that, but also how you managed the motivation to stick it out, to get to the end of that process.
I don't know if I see such a divide. I think, like, for example, when I'm making sculpture, for example, even if I take a break, I'm still thinking about it, or if I'm painting something, even when I take a break, I'm thinking about it. I think artists are always processing the art, and that there is always, like, art is a way of life for most artists, I would say. And I guess when the medium and the instrument and the image is then extended to your own body, there is less of a divide. But for me, it's about understanding what it takes to commit. So Eleanor Antin starved herself, denied herself food as a way to speak to a larger societal issue of the oppression of women's bodies from societal demands of gender norms. And she did this in 1972, So I feel like there's always an element of rigor that has taken place in all great artworks, whether it be a performance like Eleanor Antin, or whether it be the discipline that it takes to develop a particular sort of line or glazing technique that takes you to that ability to see differently, to think differently. And that's, I think, what good art does across disciplines, is that it has a sort of commitment to a formal rigor that changes the way that your eye can perceive something. And that is what motivates me.
I find that a delightfully challenging thought, to then ask myself, what is the rigor that I'm applying? Is there a formal aspect to my own work and how I think about what I do? And I think that's a great question for all of us as creative people, to be thinking about how we do what we do and why we do what we do, and how we approach that. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about that as almost like a different lens, almost a constraint that allows for a new vision, as you say. And I think that's a really exciting concept to grapple with.
Well, I think the thing that I often ask, younger artists when I'm looking at their work and they're seeking advice or whatnot, is this question: well, what's at stake for you in the work? Why?
That's a great
why are
question.
you making this work?
Yeah.
And to me, that's everything. And that is this point where these nodes meet, where the formal practice meets the conceptual and the entirety of your being and what brought you to this moment. Why are you doing this? What is at stake? And I think that that's really a huge driving force that I'm always looking for in my own work, is answering that question. And the answer changes on the daily. It's something that you don't figure out. It's a constantly evolving. You have to be, like, nimble and responsive and aware as best you can be. I'm not saying by any means that I am, but it's something I aspire to be.
That's great, because that actually leads me to another question. I'm exploring this idea of creative risk. And as I mentioned earlier, I really feel that your work really embodies risk on so many levels. And I'm curious whether you feel that there's an expectation, either internal or external, to constantly be delivering a degree of risk in your work, or to elevate the degree of risk. Is the audience expecting more from you, something more daring, more edgy? Or are you expecting that of yourself? Is there this sort of pressure to raise the stakes?
No, I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit. I really don't give a shit what the audience expects of me in terms of being risky or daring. That's not why I make work. I'm not reckless. You know, people say risk, you're letting yourself on fire. No, I'm working with a professional stunt team. I've taken all the protocols. I've gone to stunt school. You know, I'm not just flailing my body in clay. I've worked for 6 months to condition my tendons. I've taken tiny, minute, analog, thoughtful steps of preparation to complete something that surprises you. And that I don't see that as any different than someone developing any other formal technique. You know, I'm not just charging into it. I think I just want to delineate the difference between risk and recklessness, because I think they're often conflated.
Okay.
And I do think I take risk in that I push myself to grapple with difficult problems. And that feels much more risky than some of the physical stuff I do, you know? Because a lot of the physical stuff I do, I approach from the mindset of an athlete training for an end result, right? Like, you don't just haul off and run a marathon. You'd pull your Achilles, or you wouldn't complete it. You have to stake out a careful preparation that slowly, inch by inch, moves and prepares your body so that not only can you complete it, but you could complete it double if you need to, you know? And that's the kind of preparation that I take for the sort of physical aspects of my work. And then in terms of, if people I do feel like there have been moments where people expect a sort of, especially with the early works like Cuts, you know, when I was like younger, there was a kind of salacious expectation for a sort of fetishized naked muscular body. And I really feel like a lot of my works, my movements towards abstraction to further the dialogue and refocus the attention on the concerns that I think are really important versus a more superficial is something that I do. And yes, there is a risk that you may lose the audience that wants just that like dangling excitement of a salacious image, but that's not the work I'm interested in making. Or if I am using that imagery, it's towards an end, and that's not, and the end isn't like the superficial aspect of it. And so, all this to say, if I'm taking risks, it's not for shock or risk's sakes, or to, cause people to sit on the edge of their seats for the sake of it. It's because I want people, I'm trying to hyper perform and exaggerate the sort of certain conditions of our society that exist, such that you see the construction as opposed to just kind of blindly consume it. And that's ideally where I'm trying to turn the gaze towards, like someone like Anton in 72 starving herself. You know, the image from beginning to end isn't that extreme, actually. I mean, she loses some weight, but it's not the sort of extremity that is present in today's society, where you can go on these websites, and see like these like websites for thinspiration, like anorexia thinspiration, where these people are like literally barely, they're just, bags of bone and flesh, that there's such an extremity to our society now that in many ways the work has to reflect the extremity in order to be current, but that's different than, being salacious. It's about using the formal language of the cultural conditions that we're living in such a way that you hyper exaggerate and perform them to turn them back, such that people can have a sort of clarity and vision as to how extreme and ridiculous and insane that is.
Yeah. No, what's wonderful is that it's very theatrical, it's very performative, but it isn't entertaining. Anything that could be misconstrued as salacious isn't, because there is such a rigor underpinning everything. But that actually begs another question: is what is the role of the audience? What is the purpose of doing it in front of a live audience versus you could have, for example, indistinguishable fire, when you were literally set on fire. You could have done that in a studio without any audience there in a completely controlled setting. But why do you choose to incorporate this live performative element?
I incorporate a live performative element because there is no substitution for a live performative element. The sort of way that you experience a burning body when it's right in front of you is really different than the way that you experience the mediated body through a camera. And a point of a work like Inextinguishable Fire, the real work is the juxtaposition of live and technology. So when that was performed at the National Theatre in London, the audience witnessed the preparation of the body for the stunt, which is me being induced into a hypothermic state, because the danger isn't so much of the fire, burning through your fabric and burning your skin, but moreover that you'll start to perspire and that your sweat will start to boil underneath your fabric, and that will burn your skin. So they have to induce you into a state of hypothermia, ironically, as you're lit on fire. And so the audience is exposed to the entire sort of making of that image. Me starting nude on stage, and the gels and the freezing cold Novex solution cloth which the costume is dipped in and saturated is placed on my body, and very slowly the microphones on stage are turned up so that you hear the engagement between me and the stunt team, and the shivering of my jaw, the sound of the solutions as it sloshed over my body, the sound of the crackle of the flame. And although the stunt only lasts 14 seconds, most people in that room feel like they're going to throw up. And then they're taken outside to watch a projection of that very same action on the side of the South Bank Center at a heavily trafficked pedestrian walkway where hundreds and hundreds of people are walking by on the hour and not even looking up from their cell phone, And so this audience is able to have this experience of what it is to have known in their body what it is to witness another body going through an experience, and then what it is for them to see the mediation of that, and not only their experience of the mediation, but others who weren't there to witness the real, and the sort of lack of registry of that image as a result of not being there to register the real. So I don't think of film or photography merely as documentation. I think of them as ways to pointing out the difference between the mediated and the live. And that sort of discrepancy of perception is something I'm very interested in. So the role of the audience depends on the work. I think initially I was really interested in the audience as witness, for something like Becoming an Image, how often the idea of an audience is a sort of passive spectatorship, where you pay money for a ticket and you come and you watch and you're entertained and you leave. But I was interested in this way of hijacking the physiology of the audience's body to make them part of the work, and to make the act of their own perception part of the work. And that's something I continue to be interested in. But I'm also interested in, so this idea of not only witnessing, but the complicity, like what it is to stand by. And I think with something like Inextinguishable Fire, that was made in 2015. And there was a lot of, this is not directly related in the work itself, but I guess I had gone to stunt school. I had been studying the ways that, images of violence were constructed. And I was curious about that, and I was thinking about when I went to stunt school and I saw this static burn being performed. That's wow, that looks just like the ultimate act of protest, self-immolation, and thinking back to the Vietnam War and thinking back to all the various moments in time where people have self-immolated as a form of protest. And then at that moment, that summer, Mike Brown was shot by police. There was so much incredible police violence and this totally unjust racialized violence that was taking place in the States, and the way in which it was being reported was so clearly about casting, oppressed folks of color as instigators and hoodlums, as opposed to uprising against a history of racialized prejudice and fascism of a white supremacist state, And so although that's not something you read in the image, I was really interested in creating a performance, but also a film. When you look at the film itself, you know, it's like constantly feeding you new information within the frame as to how to experience what the image means. And so I was really thinking about the audience as tasking them with a kind of conceptual problem of like, what does it mean to believe in the ways that we're being fed information and how we form our opinions about who we are in allegiance with and who we help and who we ignore. Mm-hmm. And so I see the audience as an active participant, and I see art as a way to use a sort of monkey wrench into the subconscious of folks to ask them to think about how it is they're perceiving things, and to question those ideas that are like baked into us via the way that we're raised and societally like force fed, you know?
Mm. I feel like anything I have to say is going to sound incredibly banal by contrast. I have a live theater performance background, but in a very safe, traditional theater sort of way. I feel like any comparisons I make will be very inept. However, I do think there is something extraordinary about the energy that can happen in a room when you have live people witnessing something, anything that is happening, and they have a collective shared experience that they would probably not have anywhere else, that they are witnessing, even if it's witnessing entertainment, just to say a musical on Broadway. There is a shared experience that we don't have in other parts of our lives. And the sheer fact of sitting next to a stranger and sharing an experience changes both how we see how we relate to what we're seeing and how we relate to each other in that space. For a short period of time, a community is created. And it's extraordinary to think about the experience of these micro communities that you're creating as they're witnessing these events that you are creating for them, and the lasting impact of that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on there. And I mean, I think like initially the work was about kind of making people wake up, so to speak. And I think much more now the work is about creating acts of solidarity and bringing communities together and creating the act of witnessing as a sort of shared experience of healing, or a way of being there to witness each other as we are vulnerable together, you know? And I think the live aspect is more important now than it was even 10 years ago. I feel like the ways in which we're ever increasingly, especially now with like social isolation and having nothing but screens as a way to connect. I mean, like the power of live is almost going to be taboo after this, you know, to touch another person's skin in public, you know, it's going to mean something so different.
Are you thinking differently about your work going forward as a result of the current coronavirus pandemic?
Well, yes, I've had to adapt certain ideas that I've been working on that were really based about people being able to move around freely. And so I've definitely had to pivot my work to adapt to this new digital self-isolated world we're in. And that's like particular to one or two pieces that I had that are going to happen regardless. Other works that, you know, were, you know, set to slate in galleries and theaters and that kind of thing, those will have to, I think that the construct of the ideas are still, I think they have different meanings now because of course everything's viewed through the lens of the present, you know, but I do think that rather than changing the work per se, that the meaning of bodies being on top of each other, or the traces of bodies left, it'll just have a different resonance now, you know. It'll speak more to, you know, I just keep thinking back to, you know, I'm on this island in the middle of nowhere, and like, but there's a little communal grocery store, and I saw this like elderly man shopping the other day, and he was like he seemed to me clearly to be like a performatively like elderly gay man, you know?
Mm.
And I just looked at him and I was thinking, wow, this is your second plague, you know?
Yeah.
I bet you never thought you'd live through a second plague.
Mm.
And thinking about the sort of language, you know, I've had curators call me and be like, what does it mean for us to, you know, what does it even mean to have a theater now? Or what does it even mean to have like an art gallery now? It's like, well, what did it mean like in the time of the Holocaust or in the time of, you know, the time of the AIDS crisis or post like Hiroshima? Like art always has a meaning and a necessity to exist. And it always means something. So again, I just think it's about like the context and the read shifts, and it's just about understanding what that means for you as an artist in relation to the imagery you're using, you know, and how to think about that as opposed to being tone deaf or plodding along as if it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
You know, to be responsive.
I think that's another element that I really admire about your work is that it is such a considered and powerful response to things that are happening right now, and that things that either we can all relate to, or if they're not part of our immediate experience because of where we are on the social, economic, political divide, we have a way in. You're giving us a way of, if not understanding it fully, a way of grappling with some of the often the visceral elements of it, which then, because that's a human thing that we can all relate to, that gives us a way of relating to the core question or challenge or the prompt that you're exploring.
Yeah.
Do you have a practice outside of the performative work that you do? I know that you studied painting at some point in your career.
Well, I mean, I make so many different kinds of, like I work in many different mediums, right? So like I make sound installations, I make films, I make photos, I make cyanotypes, I make glass blown sculptures, I make like right now I'm working on I'm working on a social media campaign that is very much an artwork. I see collaborative efforts as artworks. I mean, I'd say I work across many, many different mediums, you know, so I absolutely have a practice, that again, like I like the performances are sometimes with the body, sometimes, using sort of larger, frameworks in place that I can't do with my own body, where I need to rely on others' expertise. So I have a very broad practice that certainly extends beyond the body.
And just going back briefly to this idea of where we are now with social distancing and not having galleries open or theaters or so on, would you have I'm completely putting you on the spot here, but would you have a message or something that you would want other artists to be thinking about in this period?
Well, I think in this moment, it's really easy for artists to undermine their contribution. You know, we feel like, wow, you know, my wife's a nurse, you know, and she can go and save a life. And what an important, urgent necessity that is. But actually, if we didn't have artists in this moment, there'd be no books to read, there'd be no movies to watch, there'd be nothing to look at in many ways. And the fact that we are not able to touch each other and to look into each other's actual eyeballs with intimacy, art has the possibility to create those connections. And that is part of what makes us human. And it's part of what keeps us from eating each other. And so it is a tremendous importance that artists continue establishing those possibilities for intimacy and connection in this moment.
Wonderful. That is such a perfect place for us to end, I think. That is a brilliant reminder of the value of what it is that we have to offer. Because as you say, there are so many practical concerns, really immediate life and death concerns, and it's sometimes hard to remember the value of the other, of the things that remind us to be generous, to be loving and accepting, and those other things that keep us bound together. So, as you say, so that we don't eat each other, which is probably not a good idea at this point in time.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's fantastic. That's absolutely wonderful. Do you have a creative challenge for listeners?
I'd say my creative challenge, as artists, we have a tremendous privilege to have this talent to create voice and to amplify and to take something that people might not understand or think about and to really elevate that discussion. I've been really thinking about my role in the sort of hierarchies of power and structure. And I really think it's important for artists to use their skill set to help amplify the voices of those that don't have the ability to speak or who can't. And so I think the role of allyship in art is really important. And so I'd say my creative task would be, how can you use your artistic power, your artistic voice, to help amplify the voice of someone who does not feel like they have, or throughout, because of larger sort of socio-political conditions, or because of sickness, or because of despair, or loneliness, or mental health, or whatever it may be. How is it that you can use your tool as an artist to help express and reflect their need?
That is fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to see what people do with that. That is wonderful. Cassils, thank you so much for your time. This conversation has been an echo of my experience of your work, and that is that it is inspiring and stimulating and challenging and absolutely compelling. So thank you so much for making the time to speak with me. If people want to see your work or find out more about you, where's the best place for them to find you online?
Well, firstly, it's a pleasure, and I appreciate you persistently hunting me down through this COVID moment. It was hard to connect a little bit, but just general with everybody. If people want to find out more about my work, they can go to my Instagram, which is @CassilsArtist. They can also go to cassils.net, which is my art website. And then as well, I'm working on a new artist initiative. It's a coalition of 80 artists that are coming together to abolish for-profit immigrant detention in the United States. And we are going to be launching a massive nationwide day of action on the 4th of July. And if you visit our Instagram page, which is @InPlainSightMap, you can see this unfurling of the artist's content, who we'll be working with. So every day, kind of like an advent calendar up to the 4th of July, we're showcasing a new artist's work. Not the work that we're going to be doing on the 4th, but it gives you a sense of that artist's practice and background and how it is that we'll be working together.
Fantastic. And I will put links to all of those in the show notes so
Cool.
people can find them. Brilliant. Well, Cassils, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. Likewise. Really nice to talk with you. Great questions. Appreciate it.
Hey there, just a few things before you go. Are you a practicing artist or creative? Could your practice benefit from a boost? I've put together 52 dares and challenges to inspire and invigorate any creative practice. These include challenges to collaborate with an animal, create nude self-portraits, and even prompts around pricing and selling your work. You can find out more on the Practical Creative website at thepracticalcreative.life or on Instagram @practicalcreative. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe to the show, and leave a review on iTunes. It not only helps to extend the reach of the podcast, it also shares the fantastic work of all of my guests. Finally, if you're looking for a bit of inspiration at work, check out my other Instagram, @ArtForEntrepreneurs, where I create and share original artwork and posters inspired by some of the biggest names in entrepreneurship. That's at art4, FOR, entrepreneurs. Thanks for listening. Until next time.